Now that Hyper-V is installed, it's time we should start creating some virtual machines. And this video is going to address a lot of questions I get for people that are new to virtual machines. The concept of a software operating system being installed over the top of their existing software operating system sometimes can be rather foreign. So let's get a couple of these things out of the way right now. A couple of questions that people that are new to virtualization always seem to ask. So firstly, when I install a virtual machine, is it going to overwrite my existing operating system? Well, the answer there is definitely a resounding no. It's not going to overwrite your existing operating system. That's a big question because I tell you, if I didn't know about virtual machines and how they work, I'd be cautious about installing a new operating system on top of my old one as well. So no, you will not overwrite your existing operating system when you install a new one inside a virtual machine. Not unless something drastic and unexpected happens, of course. So I'm just covering myself there just in case of any unexplained emergencies like UFO landings or whatnot. But in general, you won't affect your host operating system. Now, the second question I get a lot, is it free to install a virtual machine? Well, the easy answer to that question is no. Nothing's free. But depending on what version of Windows 2008 you have, Microsoft do allow you to install other virtual machines as part of the original license. But to be technically accurate, every single copy of whatever operating system you decide to install inside a virtual machine, it pretty much works and costs the same and has the same laws governing it than you would have for a real physical machine's operating system. So, unless Microsoft or another operating system or application vendor tells you otherwise, you will need to think of a virtual copy of Windows being the same as a physical copy of Windows, at least from a licensing perspective. Now, the other question I get, well, it's not really a question, but the other line of thought, I guess, I'll put it that way, is along the lines of what's the difference between a virtual machine and a physical machine, apart from the obvious fact that one's installed on a physical machine and the other's installed inside a virtual computer. Well, guys, you have to think of a virtual machine as a real computer, with the obvious exception that there's no physical machine to speak of. A virtual machine is by all accounts a live, real functioning computer, and you have to simply think of it that way because 99% of the management of that machine, 99% of the problems that you'll have with any server, 99% of the day-to-day issues you'll have, 99% of pretty much everything about that machine should be identical to what you'd experience if the same machine was a physical one rather than a virtual one. The only difference is that you'll have the overhead of managing the virtual application as well. But that's pretty much it. But you're going to learn that Hyper-V is very easy to work with. But rather than me telling you all about it, let's just start creating some virtual machines and let's see how easy this all is. Now, before we get started and create some virtual machines here, I do want to make clear that when we first installed the Hyper-V role in an earlier video, on that summary screen, the installation referred to Hyper-V as being a beta role. So to make sure that you have the most up-to-date version, simply head off to Windows Update, apply any updates to Hyper-V that you find, and that'll bring it up to the current version. Now, that's something you should be doing anyway, updating your servers, but I just wanted to point that out. So here we are in the Server Manager console. So we're going to go up to our Hyper-V section by expanding roles. We'll expand Hyper-V. We'll select our Hyper-V Manager. And here's our server, which of course I called Hyper-V. Now this is where I said it might be a little confusing with me calling this server Hyper-V. So you're just going to see whatever your server name is here. So mine says Hyper-V. This is just the server name, nothing actually to do with Hyper-V itself. So this here is the Hyper-V console, and we've seen this before. So to create a virtual machine here, we can either right-click on our server name, and we can select a new virtual machine, or we can do all of the same things from this Actions pane over here on the right. Now, strangely, I'm a right-click person. I'm used to right-clicking things to get what I want, but with this console, I'm actually the opposite. I like to use this Actions menu here on the right-hand side, and that's rather strange for me, and honestly, I can't tell you why I prefer to use the Actions menu. I just do. So whatever we do in this video, you can interchange things that I click in this Actions menu for things on the right-click menu. Use whatever method suits you. There's no right or wrong. So we're going to select New, and in the little flyout menu here, we'll choose Virtual Machine. Now this is going to fire up the new virtual machine wizard as you'd expect, and this first screen here just gives us an overview of virtual machines, Now it does tell you that you can simply click Finish here and it's going to create a virtual machine with all of the default values. But in order to know what those default values are, we'll at least need to run through this wizard once so we can see what settings Hyper-V considers to be a default machine. So I'm going to check this box here to not show this page again. I really don't need to see this summary screen. Okay, so obviously the first thing we'll need to do here is to give our virtual machine a name. Now, this name is a name for the virtual machine itself. Now, this is the name which we'll see this machine listed as in our Hyper-V console. It's not the host name of the computer that we're going to install. That's a totally separate thing, and we'll see that later on. So let's just say for this virtual machine that we're going to install a copy of Windows 2008. So let's just call it that, Windows 2008. Now the files for this machine will be installed at this path here, and we can change that if we like. In fact, I will change this because this program data folder, by the way, is a default hidden folder. And I really like to see this machine stored in a different folder. And in all honesty, they should be stored on a different drive other than the system drive, or in other words, probably not on the C drive. So in production, I'd make it a different drive, and preferably a fault-tolerant one as well. So I'm going to check the box here, and we'll click Browse, and I'm going to go to the root of my C drive, and I'm going to choose to store my machines in a new folder, which I'm simply going to call VM. So we'll select that folder, and now we'll click Next. Now here we'll need to decide how much memory we want to allocate to this virtual machine. Now a couple of things about this. Firstly, think about memory as you would for a real machine. Now this defaults, as you can see, to 512 meg, and that'll probably work fine for, say, a server core edition of Windows 2008, but a GUI edition is definitely going to want more. Now it will work though with 512 meg of RAM, but quite frankly, the performance will be rubbish. So again, think about it carefully. Obviously, the other thing to mention is you can't exceed the actual memory that you have inside your real machine. So since my Hyper-V machine here, the real machine, the physical box, has only 4 gig in it, I can't go any higher than that. And don't forget that your host operating system has its own memory requirements that you'll also need to satisfy. So personally, what I like to do is leave my host operating system with at least 1 gig of RAM. So that leaves 3 gig in my case that I've got left to play with. So technically I could create, say, 6 virtual machines, each using 512 meg of RAM. Or maybe I could use 3 virtual machines with 1 gig of RAM each. Obviously, whatever you choose here is going to depend on what you're expecting from this virtual machine. You'll need to have enough memory to cover the software that you plan on installing into this virtual machine. And it's going to depend on the hardware you have inside your physical machine as well. But look, for the sake of this machine, we're really not going to be doing anything with it anyway at this time. We're just installing a virtual machine. So I'm going to leave it at 512. That way I can leave a bit of RAM over for other things. And we could easily change it later on. And I'll show you how to do that anyway. Now here's where we'll be able to configure this machine to be able to connect to our virtual network, which we learnt in a previous video is just an overly technical way of saying that this virtual machine is able to use the real network card in the physical server so it can communicate. This virtual machine that we're creating right now presumably is going to need network access to other machines in our network or to the internet, so it needs to be able to communicate through our real network card. So from the drop-down list, we'll need to choose our virtual network, and mine is set up with the name Lab, and this is just referring to the real network card in my host, and we're going to talk more about virtual networking later on. So for now, we'll just select that, and we'll click Next. Okay, so now we need to tell the wizard what sort of hard disk we're going to be using with this virtual machine. Now, we can create a new virtual hard disk. If we don't already have one that we want to use, we could use an existing one if we already have one that we've created, and we'll see how we can do this in a moment, or we can attach a virtual hard disk later on. Well, we're going to go with the top option since a computer without a hard disk is a bit useless for installing Windows on. So when we create this hard disk, we can give the hard disk file a name, and this name is really just the file name for our hard disk, and this file will be stored in this location, and it's going to be given a default size of 127 gigabytes. Now, when I say it's going to be given a default size of 127 gigabytes, it's not going to default at that size. It's not going to take up 127 gigabytes of space on our host. it can grow to this size, since what's going to happen is that this file, this Windows 2008.vhd file, is going to start off pretty small, only a few hundred K really, but as soon as we start writing to it, it's going to continually grow in size up to a maximum of 127 gig, or whatever value we specify in here. Now you also might note that this hard disk file here has taken on the same name as the virtual machine name we gave this machine a couple of screens ago, and that's always going to be the case. So had we have called the machine Windows XP, then the hard disk name would be Windows XP.vhd. But they don't have to share the same name though. You could change this so that this disk has a totally separate name, but at least in my opinion, I think it's easy to identify that this hard disk belongs to this machine when they share the same name. So I'd stick with this naming convention. I think it's much easier. Now another thing that I might point out, that a virtual hard disk uses the extension .vhd, VHD, virtual hard disk. You're going to see this a lot. The VHD extension is pretty popular. You'll see it in other applications like backup applications and so forth. It's the format that Microsoft has adapted for many things, and you're going to find that you're going to be able to pick up this hard disk file and transfer it to other machines and restore data from it and so forth using third-party applications. Now anyway, that's a subject for other videos, but be on the lookout because you're going to see a lot of things being done with this VHD format in the future. Okay, so we're going to create a hard disk called Windows 2008.vhd in a folder called Windows 2008 inside our VM folder. And the hard disk is going to be 127 gig in size up to a maximum of 2040 gig. Now if that's fine, which it is for me, I'm going to click Next. We're now able to specify what we want to do regarding installing an operating system. Now we can choose to install an operating system later, and that's the default. We can install one now if we like. Well, once we finish the installation wizard, that is, we can install it from optical media or from an image file. We can install an operating system from a floppy disk or a network-based installation server. Now if you're planning on rolling out Windows using Windows deployment services, then you'll want to go with this bottom option here, and you can check out our WDS video where we're going to show you how to do exactly that. Otherwise, you're probably going to go with the second option here to install an operating system from some sort of optical media or from an image file. Now, if we choose to go with our CD, DVD, ROM option, then this is going to use the physical CD or DVD drive that's in your server. Or in other words, you're going to have to grab a real DVD copy of Windows 2008 in this case and throw that into your DVD drive. Hyper-V will then install Windows 2008 from that DVD. Now the better option though, in my opinion, is to use the image file. This is an ISO file, which is basically just one big file containing a copy of the Windows 2008 DVD. In fact, I use ISO file for all my virtual machines because it's just so much more flexible. And normally, I'd have a share somewhere on my network with a bunch of ISO files which I can just use at a moment's notice. So there's no mucking around with media anymore, it's all in the one spot. The only downside is you're going to need a bit of space to hold the file since ISO files are pretty big. But that's what I'm going to use here. I'm going to select the image file option and we'll click Browse. Now on my C drive, for the purposes of this lab, I've already pre-prepared, if you like, a folder called ISO. But like I said, in a production environment, in fact even in my home test network, I've got a shared folder that I use to store ISOs in. Even if the vendor doesn't specifically provide an ISO of their software, generally I'll create one using a third-party program. And there's plenty around. I like Magic ISO myself, but go and take a look around. You can settle for a program to do that for you. So in here, if we open up this folder, I've got quite a few files, and you can see by the size of these files that they're pretty big, mostly a few gigabytes in size. So in here I've got a few files. I've got a 64-bit edition and a 32-bit edition of Windows 2008. I've even got a copy of the Windows 7 RTM version there as well. So what I'm going to do is, obviously I'm installing Windows 2008 here, so I'll need to go with one of these two files, the Windows 2008 ISO file. And let's go with the 64-bit edition. Of course we don't have to, we can install 32-bit, but I'd prefer to go 64-bit wherever possible. So we'll select that file, we'll click Open, and then I'll click Next. Now here we'll get our summary of the virtual machine that we're creating, and do note that down the bottom here we've got this checkbox which, if we select it, it's going to start up this machine as soon as we click Finish. So let's just click Finish right now, and we'll start our virtual machine up manually in a second, and you're going to see our virtual machine being created. Okay, so there's the machine in our list of virtual machines in the middle of our console, and you'll notice that it currently has a state of off right now, which is pretty fair considering we never told the wizard to start it up. So let's start up this machine. Now before we do that, it's probably a good idea, at least in this early stage, whilst we're becoming familiar with Hyper-V, to right-click this virtual machine and choose Connect. And what this will do is allow us to see the virtual machine screen just like we would if we were sitting at the keyboard and monitor of a real computer. Now straight away, you're going to notice a few things about this machine. Firstly, we can see that it's turned off, and to start it, we're told we'll need to select Start from the Action menu. Now, we can choose Start from our Action menu. If I just move this back over here, you can see we've got a Start option there. Now we could also click this green power icon on the toolbar. Now another way of starting this virtual machine is to go back to the list of machines here from our console, right-click on it, and choose Start. Or, selecting our virtual machine again, we also have an Actions menu here. And of course, we could also go Control-S as well. So either way, there was about 5 ways there of starting a machine. Regardless of how you do it, all of them are going to get you to the same point where we've just powered on our machine. Now, like with a real PC, this virtual machine is going to do a post or a power on self-test, and then it's going to automatically boot off the DVD. So since in the wizard a moment ago I told it to use my Windows 2008 ISO, which is the same as using a physical DVD, this system is just going to boot straight into the Windows 2008 setup, just as it would for a real physical machine. So as you can see here, we've got these files that are being copied over to our machine, and Windows has obviously just started up just like you'd expect on a real PC. Now, since I'm connected to this server using remote desktop here, I'm actually going to have a small problem, because we're installing a virtual machine over a terminal services connection, and what it's going to try and do is take over my mouse pointer. So what I'm going to have to do to compensate for this is to install this virtual machine using the keyboard. Now that's okay though, because we'll be able to use the mouse later on when we install the virtual machine integration components, but we'll get to that later on. So for now, in case you're wondering, I'm going to run through this installation really quick using the keyboard, and this is definitely not going to be a tutorial on how to install Windows, because if you don't know how to do that yet, well, I guess you'd better stop this video and go and grab our videos on how to do that first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to accept the defaults here. I'm just hitting Enter. I'll hit Enter again to begin the installation. We'll run with a standard installation, so I'm just going to hit Enter here, and then we'll accept the terms of the license agreement by hitting the spacebar, and then we'll hit Enter. I'm going to do a custom installation, and here you can see our 127 gig hard drive, and that's fine. We're going to install Windows 2008 on that, so we'll hit Enter, and then the installation is going to begin. Now at this point, ordinarily I'd be saying this is going to go and take a while, so go grab a coffee, we'll be back soon. But today, let's not do that. Let's make use of this time by creating another virtual machine. So if we go back to our console, and by the way, you'll notice here also that our Windows 2008 virtual machine has now got the state of running, and we can see the CPU usage for that machine and the uptime, so you've got a little bit of info about what this machine's up to. So let's go and create a new machine. We're going to click New, Virtual Machine. I'm going to call this one Windows 7. And again, we'll choose to store the virtual machine in a different location. We'll go with CVM, and we'll click Next. Now 512 meg is definitely not enough for Windows 7, so let's make it 1 gig, and that'll be 1024 megabytes, and we'll click Next. Our virtual network will need to be connected through our network card, so we'll choose that and click Next. Now let's go and change our hard disk to say 100 gig. That way we can see the difference. Otherwise I'm going to leave the defaults as they are with a file name of windows7.vhd. We'll click Next. We'll choose to install an operating system from our boot CD DVD, and we'll make that an ISO file. We'll click Browse, There's my Windows 7 ISO, so we'll select that and click Open. Then we'll click Next. Now this time I'm going to choose to start our virtual machine after we've created it, and we'll click Finish. Okay, so that's going to create our virtual machine, which you can see that's what it's doing, and then it's going to start it up, and because my Windows 7 DVD is a mounted ISO file, it's going to immediately start up the installation. And whilst that's happening in the background, if we go and take a look at our Windows 2008 virtual machine, we can see that that one's kicking along nicely. Alright, well let's run through our Windows 7 installation real quick. And look, if you haven't had any exposure to Windows 7 yet, you'll see that it's exactly the same as Windows 2008 really anyway. Okay, well there's the installation started, so we're just going to accept these defaults by hitting Enter. We'll hit Enter again to begin the installation. Now we'll accept the terms of the license agreement, and we'll hit Enter. We're going to do a custom installation. And here this time you can see that we do actually have a 100 gig hard drive, because don't forget, we changed the default one earlier in the wizard, and that's the effect that this is going to have. This machine now thinks it has a 100 gig hard drive as opposed to the standard 127. So we're going to install Windows 7 on that by hitting Enter, and then the installation will begin. Alright, well this time I am going to pause the video here, since we've now got two machines that we're installing, and of course two operating systems is going to take some time. But if you want to add in another machine, just do the same thing, except you might want to install Linux or Solaris inside the machine. Ultimately, it's up to you. Just install the operating system as you would normally. So let's go and take a momentary pause, and we'll be back even before you knew we were gone. Okay, well we're back, and it looks like, especially if I move this, it looks like both of our OSs are almost ready. They're just waiting for us to finalize the installation, so let's do that now. For our Windows 2008 machine, we'll need to set up our administrator's password, so we'll hit Enter, and we'll type in a password, and we'll do it again, just to confirm it. Okay, that's been changed. We'll hit Enter again, and now basically Windows 2008 is installed, and it's going to load up the desktop in a few moments. So whilst that's happening, let's switch over to our Windows 7 machine. And this wants us to create a user account, so I'm going to call my user account Trainer. And it also wants a computer name as well. I'll leave the default at Trainer PC and hit Enter. Okay, now it wants a password for our Trainer account, so let's enter in a password once and twice. And we'll also need to enter in a password hint, so I'm just going to say password here. And we'll hit Enter. Now I'm going to ignore the product key right now. I'm going to uncheck this box, and we'll tab over and hit Next. And I'm not going to waste my bandwidth with updates right now, since I'm going to blow this machine away anyway shortly. So I'll set this to Ask Me Later. And I'm going to go with the default time zone. We'll hit Enter. We'll choose a work network, and that's pretty much it. Windows 7 is going to finalize our settings here, and it'll boot into the Windows 7 desktop. So whilst that's going on, let's go back to our Windows 2008 machine, since I want to talk about something else called the Integration Services Disk. Now, this is our Windows 2008 machine, and a lot of you are going to recognize this straight away. It's almost ready to go, but there is a small problem with it right now. You may notice here under the Configure Networking section that it tells me that I have no network adapters. But you might recall that we decided to use a virtual network, our lab network, when we set up this virtual machine. So why don't we have a network card? Well, what happens is this. When you install a reasonably recent operating system like Windows 2003 with Service Pack 2, Windows Vista with Service Pack 1, and Windows 2008, in order to get the added functionality of things like faster network cards, proper video drivers, and to add other functionality like copy and paste from virtual machines to the host and vice versa, you need to install what's called Integration Services. And to do that, we'll go up to the Action menu, and this is the Action menu on the virtual machine itself, of course, and right at the bottom, we need to choose to insert the Integration Services setup disk. Now, this is going to mount this disk as a CD, just like we did for our operating system. It's going to mount this inside the virtual machine, and it's going to throw up the autoplay screen like you see here with this setup dialog box. So what we're going to have to do here is to hit Enter, and that's going to begin the installation. Now, this part here might seem a little confusing. It's telling us that a previous installation of the Hyper-V integration services was detected, and to click OK to update or repair this installation. So since there has been updates to Hyper-V, we actually do need to click OK here and update the old installation. So we'll hit enter, and that's going to start up one of the easiest installations that you're probably ever going to see in Microsoft history. It's just going to head off, do its thing by itself, and in a moment it's going to ask us to reboot this system. And there it is. Our integration services have been successfully installed. We'll need to restart by hitting enter, and whilst that's restarting our virtual machine, if we go and skip over to our Windows 7 machine, which does actually have a later version of these Hyper-V integration tools already available, and as such we're able to move around inside this virtual machine just as we would a physical machine. And you'll see here that of course with this machine we also do have a network card. Now obviously you just saw me have to update our integration services for Windows 2008. If you're using a later version of Windows 2008 Service Pack 1, 2 or Windows 2008 R2, then you won't have to do that. It's just for these earlier machines you will need to install those integration services. Windows 7, as you see, already has that included. Alright, well let's go and check on our Windows 2008 machine. It's not quite up yet. This will be rebooted in just a moment. And I want to quickly talk about another issue we have when logging on to a virtual machine. Now, ordinarily when we log on to any Windows-based machine, we'll need to use our Control-Alt-Delete key combination. And this is a key combination that us Windows users have been using for years. Now the problem is, if we hold down Control-Alt-Delete, our host operating system, this is the physical machine's operating system, is going to take over, not the guest, which of course is what we want. We want the virtual machine to be able to do a Control-Alt-Delete. So the workaround for that is to either hold down the Control and Alt keys and the End key rather than the Delete key, or we can simply come up to our Action menu and then choose Control-Alt-Delete. And this is going to send those Control-Alt-Delete key presses to the virtual machine. And of course now we're just simply able to enter in our password as per normal. And our machine, of course, is loading up, and as you can see right down here it appears that we do have internet access as evidenced by our little icon there, and that would indicate that we now have a network card. And in fact right up the top here you can see under our network card we have been configured an IP address by a DHCP server that I've got sitting here on our lab. So obviously our integration services has set up that network card. So let's test it out. Just to test that theory, let's go and open up Internet Explorer, and let's just head off to some sort of random website. Let's head off to bing.com, and there you go. Our virtual machine here obviously has access to the internet. The site loads up just fine. So our virtual machine in theory now has access to the internet as any normal physical machine would, and this virtual machine has the same needs and wants as a physical machine does. So in other words, just because it's a virtual machine, don't think that it's any less susceptible to viruses or spyware than a real machine is. This is, in effect, a real server. The only difference is that it happens to be running on top of another machine. And for the most part, we can create more and more machines just like this one on top of our Hyper-V physical host. So now we can go and close this window if we like. And don't worry, we aren't closing down the machine itself. We're just getting rid of the window. And if we want to get that window back, we can simply go back to our Hyper-V console, and we can either double click on our file name here, or we could right click and choose Connect. And there's our machine back again. Now if you want to shut down or restart this machine, you'd simply do it like you would a physical copy of Windows. You'd do it from the Windows Start menu. So you'd simply go into the virtual machine, you'd click Start, then you'd choose Shut Down or Restart. On the other hand though, let's say we've got a non-responsive virtual machine that needs to be physically powered down or reset. Well, we can do those things from the toolbar. Now up the top here of our virtual machine, we've got options to send the Control-Alt-Delete key combination, and we've seen what that does already. We can power on a machine if it's off by clicking the Start button, and we've seen how we can do that. We could power it off, which is just like hitting the power button or pulling the plug out on a real machine. we can shut down a machine, which is going to try and send the shutdown command to the actual operating system inside this virtual machine, if it happens to be a supported one. So if you're running something like Linux or Solaris inside your virtual machine and you attempt to shut it down, that's not going to do anything. But if it's running a supported operating system like Windows 2008 or Windows 7, the Hyper-V software is going to tell the guest operating system to shut down, which is just the same as if I was to click Start and then go and shut down this machine manually. Now the next thing we can do, we can save our virtual machine, which doesn't shut the virtual machine down exactly, but it kind of shuts it down from the perspective of Hyper-V itself. So what it really does is it leaves it in a safe state, so it's quick to restart. In fact, let's click Save right now, and you can watch down the bottom here, this progress bar. It's pretty quick to save this machine and shut it down. Okay, our machine's obviously turned off, as you can see, so we want to start it up again, so we'll go and click the power button to start this thing up, and you can see down here that it's restoring this machine, and just look how fast it takes to get this machine back up and running. Alright, well that couldn't really have been any more than 5 or 6 seconds, so it's really, really quick. Now our other options at the top here, we could pause a virtual machine, we could reset our virtual machine, which is just like hitting the reset switch on your physical server, and we can take a snapshot, something we're going to look at in detail in a later video. Okay, so that's virtual machines. They're just like real computers, as we've seen, except they only exist in software, and they'll do pretty much everything a real machine will do, with perhaps the exception of playing some high-end games. So in this video, you've seen that it's just as simple as pie to create a virtual machine and install an operating system. I mean, it's the same thing as doing it on a physical machine, really, so if you can do that, then you can do this too. So we hope you've enjoyed this video, and we'd like to thank you for watching.